The Fairhaven lineage was known for two things: its ancient influence in the king's court and the two daughters who walked its halls. One was a masterpiece designed to be adored, the other was a sketch left in the shadows. Arabella Fairhaven turned heads in every ballroom with her glittering gold gowns, hair like spun silk, and a presence so effortless it seemed divine. Liora, the quieter sister, had the unfortunate distinction of standing in her wake. She dressed simply in plain, modest gowns, her hair styled with a neatness that never invited a second glance. She was not bitter or unkind, she had simply become comfortable in the quiet corners of the estate. On the evening of the formal debut, the ballroom was a sea of amber light and desperate ambition. Every eye was fixed on the entrance, waiting for the one man whose favor could alter the course of a family's history. When Duke Julian Fairhaven, a man of immense confidence and dark intensity, arrived at the gathering, a hush fell over the crowd. He was a figure of sharp angles and deliberate movement, dressed in a formal coat of midnight blue that made him seem like a shadow come to life. All assumed his eye would fall on Arabella, who stood at the center of the room like a sun around which all others orbited. She wore a gown of shimmering gold, her smile practiced and perfect, already anticipating the moment he would claim her hand. But during a moment filled with the soft rustle of silk and the expectant holding of breath, the Duke did the unthinkable. He walked past the gold-clad beauty without so much as a lingering glance. He did not stop for the practiced curtsies or the fluttering fans of the debutantes. Instead, he moved toward the edge of the light, where Liora stood near the heavy velvet curtains, trying to remain invisible. He stopped before her, his posture protective and deliberate. Without a word of flourish, he reached out and took her hand. It was a gesture that shattered the room's composure. Arabella's smile dropped so fast it seemed to break upon the floor, and her mother nearly choked on her champagne. Liora simply blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up into his intense, unreadable eyes, her breath hitching in a throat tight with confusion. She was the sister they kept in the shadows, the one who was never supposed to be seen, yet she was the only one he had looked for. The morning following the debut was as grey and somber as the ballroom had been bright. Inside the Fairhaven drawing room, the air felt thick with the residue of Arabella's tears and the sharp, jagged edges of their mother's disappointment. Liora sat by the window, her fingers trembling as she worked a piece of embroidery she had no heart for, until the butler announced the Duke's arrival. Julian Fairhaven entered the room not like a suitor, but like a general surveying a map. He did not bring flowers, nor did he offer the practiced pleasantries expected of a man who had just upended the social order. He waited until the room was cleared of hovering servants and watchful relatives, then he sat across from Liora, his dark coat a stark contrast to the delicate floral patterns of the settee. For a long moment, he simply watched her, his gaze heavy and analytical. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, steady vibration that seemed to command the very air. "I believe in clarity above all else, Liora," he began, his expression devoid of the warmth usually reserved for a betrothal. "The spectacle last night was a necessity, but what follows must be an understanding." He leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely between his knees. He looked every bit the powerful, intense man the ton feared, yet there was a chilling calm in his delivery. "I am in need of a duchess who understands the weight of a name and the silence of a house. I require a partner who is content with respect and security, but who expects nothing more." Liora looked up from her stitching, her eyes meeting his. The intensity in his stare was almost physical, a pressure she had never felt before. "You speak of a contract," she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I speak of a marriage of convenience," Julian clarified, his jaw tightening slightly. "There is no need for romance in this arrangement. I have seen the wreckage that passion leaves behind, and I have no desire to invite it into my life again. You will be provided for. You will have the Fairhaven protection and my name. In return, I require only your decency and your presence. I require no affection." The words were cold, delivered without flourish or apology. He was offering her a life that mirrored the one she had lived in the shadows, quiet, overlooked, and solitary only now, it would be behind the high stone walls of a ducal estate. Liora felt a strange, steadier force rise within her. She was a woman used to being a duty, a girl who had lived her life as a footnote to her sister's beauty. She did not cry. She did not recoil. She simply nodded once, a quiet acceptance of the terms. "If that is what you require," she whispered, "then I accept." Julian did not smile. He simply stood, adjusting his cuffs with a sharp, final movement. "We shall marry in the autumn," he said, and without another word, he left her alone in the grey morning light. The days following the announcement of the engagement felt like a slow retreat into a winter that had arrived far too early. The Fairhaven estate, once a place of vibrant, if shallow, social ambition, had become a house of whispers. Arabella was a ghost in her own home, her golden beauty dimmed by a resentment that she wore like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Liora, meanwhile, moved through the corridors with the same practiced invisibility she had maintained for years, though now the silence that followed her was weighted with the weight of the Duke's name. Julian visited often during those weeks, though his presence was more like a shadow falling over the house than a light entering it. He spent his time in the library with Liora's father or walking the grounds with a surveyor, his movements precise and his words clipped. When he did speak to Liora, it was with a chilling, polite distance, discussions of travel arrangements to his northern estate, the selection of a wedding veil, and the management of the Fairhaven accounts. He treated her with the respect one might afford a trusted steward, never unkind, but entirely detached. One afternoon, seeking the sanctuary of the library to return a volume on botany she had finished, Liora found the heavy oak doors slightly ajar. She paused, her hand hovering near the wood, when she heard the low, resonant vibration of Julian's voice coming from within. He was not alone. The scent of expensive tobacco drifted through the gap, and the voice of a man she recognized as Lord Sterling, Julian's closest confidant, followed. "You've certainly set the ton ablaze, Julian," Sterling said, his tone carrying a note of baffled amusement. "To pass over a diamond like Arabella for the sister who has spent her life in the corners. The world is asking why." Liora froze. The air in the hallway seemed to thin, and she felt a familiar, hollow ache beginning to settle in her chest. She knew she should walk away, to retreat back into the shadows where she belonged, but her feet felt as though they had taken root in the floorboards. "Arabella is a spectacle," Julian replied, his voice devoid of any warmth. "She is a woman who thrives on the gaze of others. To marry her would be to invite a lifetime of demands, of passion, of attention, of a heart that I have no interest in offering. I have no room for a wife who expects to be the center of my world." "And Liora?" Sterling asked. There was a brief, agonizing silence. Liora held her breath, her fingers curling into the fabric of her plain muslin gown. "Liora is unremarkable," Julian said plainly, the words striking her with the force of a physical blow. "She has existed in the shadows for so long that she has learned not to ask for the light. She is quiet, she is steady, and she will ask nothing of me. That is what makes her safe. I require a shield against the world's expectations of love, Sterling, and Liora is the perfect screen. She will not demand a heart that no longer exists." Liora did not stay to hear the rest. She turned and moved down the hallway with a grace that only women used to being overlooked truly understand. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury for those who expected to be comforted. Instead, she returned to her room and closed the door with a soft, final click. She stood by her window, looking out at the gardens where Arabella had so often been the center of every eye. She was unremarkable. She was safe. She was a shield. The Duke had not chosen her for the soul she had carefully cultivated in the quiet, or for the intelligence she had sharpened in the library. He had chosen her because he believed she was small enough to be ignored even while standing at his side. A strange, cold fire flickered to life in the depths of her being. For years, she had accepted the world's assessment of her worth, but hearing it from the man who was to be her husband, the man who had looked into her eyes and seen only a convenient void, changed something. She was a shield, perhaps, But even a shield had its own strength. If he wanted a woman who would ask nothing of him, she would provide it. But she would no longer be a girl trapped by duty. She would be a woman who, however quietly, was beginning to realize that even the shadows have a presence that cannot be avoided. The transition to the Duke's household began in spirit long before the vows were to be spoken. In the weeks that followed their cold agreement, Julian required the Fairhaven accounts to be integrated with his own vast holdings, a task usually reserved for a small army of stewards and weary clerks. It was a chore of ink and dust, one that typically happened behind closed doors while the ladies of the house occupied themselves with the more essential matters of silk swatches and guest lists. Julian entered the sun-drenched library of the Fairhaven estate on a Tuesday morning, expecting to find Liora's father struggling with the mountain of paperwork he had sent over. Instead, the room was steeped in a profound, scholarly silence. Liora was seated at the heavy mahogany desk, a shaft of morning light illuminating the fine, stray hairs at the nape of her neck. She did not look up when he entered. Her focus was absolute, her posture poised with a quiet sort of grace that Julian had previously dismissed as mere passivity. He approached the desk, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rug. He expected to see a book of poetry or perhaps a list of household linens. Instead, he saw the massive, leather-bound estate ledgers. Liora's hand moved with rhythmic precision, the nib of her pen scratching across the parchment as she entered columns of numbers with a clarity that rivaled a professional scrivener's. "I was under the impression your father was handling the audit," Julian said, his voice cutting through the silence. Liora did not jump. She finished her line, blotted the ink with a piece of sand, and only then looked up at him. Her eyes were calm, devoid of the nervous fluttering he had come to expect from women in his presence. "My father finds the numbers temperamental," she replied softly. "I have managed the Fairhaven ledgers since I was 16. It is a quiet task, and it suits me." Julian leaned over the desk, his shadow falling across the pages. He was a man who understood power, and power in his world was built on the bedrock of finance. He scanned the entries, expecting errors or the simplistic calculations of a hobbyist. What he found instead was a mastery of complex interest rates and land tenant disputes that even his own steward had struggled to resolve. She had not only balanced the books, she had found efficiencies that would save the estate hundreds of pounds in the coming harvest. He looked at the ledger, then back at her. He remembered his words to Sterling, how he had called her unremarkable, a safe vessel that would ask nothing of him. He had viewed her as a blank canvas, a woman whose lack of presence would allow him to retreat into his own cold solitude. "You have corrected the interest on the Blackwood mortgage," he observed, his voice lower now, shadowed by a sudden, sharp realization. "My own clerks missed that discrepancy for 3 years. It was a simple matter of looking at the original deed rather than the subsequent summaries," Liora said, beginning to close the book. "Most people prefer the summary. It is easier to digest, though it often misses the truth of the thing." Julian stood back, his arms folded across his chest. The library suddenly felt smaller, the air charged with a tension that was no longer born of mutual indifference. He had spent his life looking at the surface of things, at the glittering gold of women like Arabella, or the unremarkable muslin of women like Liora. He had chosen her because he thought there was nothing beneath the surface to challenge him. For the first time since their engagement began, he truly looked at her. He saw the ink stain on her middle finger, the sharp intelligence behind her steady gaze, and the quiet strength of a woman who had run a household from the shadows while her sister took the applause. "I told my friend that you were unremarkable," he said, the confession falling between them with the weight of a stone. Liora did not flinch. "I know. I was in the hallway." Julian felt a rare, uncomfortable heat rise in his chest. "I find that I have made a grave error, Liora. Not in choosing you, but in the reasons I believed I did." He paused, his gaze lingering on the ledgers she had mastered. "I thought I was choosing a shield. I realize now that I simply failed to look correctly." Liora stood, smoothing her skirts with a steady hand. "Most people fail to look correctly at things that do not demand their attention," Your Grace. I am used to it. I suspect, Julian said, his voice holding a new, dangerous thread of curiosity, that I shall find it increasingly difficult to look away. He did not apologize further, nor did she ask for it. But as he turned to leave the library, he paused at the door, watching her return to her work. She was no longer a shadow to him. She was a person with a presence he could no longer avoid, and for a man who had built his life on the safety of solitude, that realization was the most unsettling thing of all. The dining room of the Fairhaven estate felt less like a place of nourishment and more like a stage where the actors had forgotten their lines but refused to leave the spotlight. Candlelight flickered against the heavy silver service, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the rigid posture of those seated around the table. The air was thick with the scent of roasted pheasant and the sharp, metallic tang of unexpressed resentment. Arabella sat opposite the Duke, her gown a defiant shade of crimson that seemed to cry out for the attention she felt had been stolen from her. She played with her wine glass, the stem clicking rhythmically against her ring, a sound that grated against the silence like a dull blade. Liora sat beside Julian, her own presence as muted as the pale lavender of her dress. She felt the weight of the Duke's proximity, a steady warmth that she was still learning to navigate. The conversation had been a series of shallow drifts, weather, the upcoming harvest, the tediousness of the London season, until Arabella, fueled by a third glass of sherry and a lifetime of being the center of the world, turned her gaze toward Liora. I hear you have been spending your mornings in the library again, Liora, Arabella said, her voice carrying that light, melodic trill that usually preceded a sting. Mother and I were quite concerned. Surely there are more becoming ways for a future duchess to spend her time than squinting over those dusty, miserable ledgers. It seems a dreadfully dull pursuit for someone of your station. A heavy silence descended upon the table. Lyra's mother offered a tight, nervous smile, her eyes darting toward the Duke. It is merely a hobby, I'm sure. Liora has always had a peculiar fondness for quiet tasks. It isn't just quiet, Mother. It's positively monastic, Arabella continued, her eyes bright with a cruel sort of triumph. I should think Julian would prefer a wife who can discuss the latest opera or the finer points of a quadrille, rather than one who can tell him the exact cost of grain in the northern fields. It is so terribly unladylike to have a mind for nothing but sums and tax disputes. It makes one wonder if there is any room left for anything of interest. Liora kept her gaze fixed on her plate, her fingers tightening around her silver fork. She felt the familiar urge to retreat, to let the mockery wash over her until she became invisible once more. She was used to being the dull sister, the one whose value was measured only by how well she highlighted Arabella's brilliance. Before she could offer a quiet deflection, Julian's voice cut through the tension. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a chilling, absolute authority that caused Arabella to freeze mid-sip. Interest, Arabella, is a matter of perspective, Julian said, his voice as smooth as polished stone. He did not look at Arabella, he looked directly at Liora, his expression unreadable but intense. Most people find the foundation of a house dull because they are too busy admiring the paint on the walls. But without the foundation, the paint eventually cracks, and the house falls. He turned his gaze toward Arabella, his eyes narrowing slightly. Liora has spent her morning identifying a structural flaw in the Fairhaven accounts that has persisted for nearly a generation. She has a mind that sees order where others see only chaos. To call such a capability dull is to admit a profound lack of understanding of what it takes to actually lead an estate or a life. Arabella's face flushed a deep, mottled red. I only meant. I know exactly what you meant, Julian interrupted, his tone final. You find her pursuit dull because it requires a depth of focus that does not invite an audience. I, however, find it far more compelling than the hollow performance of a quadrille. I did not choose a wife to entertain me with gossip, I chose a partner whose intellect is the anchor of this family. He reached out, his hand covering Lyora's on the table. It was a brief, deliberate touch, but to Liora, it felt like a revolution. For the first time in her life, someone had not just seen her work, but had defended the very thing that made her unremarkable as her greatest strength. Lyra's mind is not unladylike, Julian added, his voice softening just enough to be terrifying. It is brilliant. And I would suggest that in the future, we treat it with the reverence it deserves. The rest of the dinner passed in a fractured, uneasy quiet. Arabella did not speak again, her gaze fixed sullenly on her plate. But as Lyra looked up, she caught Julian watching her. There was no cold detachment in his eyes now, no talk of safe shields or unremarkable choices. Instead, there was a spark of something real, a recognition that the woman beside him was not a screen to hide behind, but a person he was beginning to realize he might actually need. Lyra felt the stirrings of a new, stubborn kind of hope. She was no longer just a shadow being moved across a board. She was being seen, and for the first time, the light didn't feel like something to fear. The rain arrived with a heavy, relentless grayness that seemed to shrink the world to the size of the Fairhaven estate. It was the kind of evening that forced the household into quiet corners, the wind curling around the eaves like a living thing. Julian found himself drawn to the library, not for a ledger or a map, but for the silence he expected to find there. Yet, as he pushed open the heavy oak doors, he realized the room was already occupied. Lyra was seated in a high-backed velvet chair near the hearth, the amber glow of the fire dancing across the pages of a book held in her lap. She did not look up immediately, but he saw the slight tension in her shoulders relax as she recognized his footfall. She was dressed in a gown of deep forest green, a color that made her skin seem luminous in the flickering light. For a moment, Julian stayed by the door, simply watching her. He had called her unremarkable once. He had believed she was a shadow he could ignore. Now, looking at her, he felt a strange, tightening pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "You are awake late," he said, his voice sounding uncharacteristically hushed in the vast room. Lyra closed the book, her thumb marking the page. "The rain makes it difficult to sleep. It feels as though the house is holding its breath." Julian walked toward the fire, the warmth of the flames reaching out to him, but his attention remained on her. He noticed the way the light caught the copper highlights in her hair, details he had missed when he was busy looking for a shield. "I came to find a moment of quiet," he said, though the honesty of it felt dangerous. He remembered the library conversation he had with Sterling, the one she had overheard, and the weight of it seemed to hang in the air between them like smoke. "I can leave, if you prefer the room to yourself," Lyra said, making a move to rise. "No," Julian said, perhaps too quickly. "Stay. I find I no longer care for the silence as much as I once did." He moved closer, stopping just a few feet from her chair. The air between them suddenly felt charged, a static tension that made his pulse thrum with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. He looked at the book in her hand, a volume of ancient history, and then back at her steady, observant eyes. He had planned for a marriage of distance, a life where they would move like ghosts through the same halls, never truly touching. "Lyra," he began, his voice low and roughened by an emotion he couldn't quite name. "When I spoke to Sterling, when I said you were safe because you were unremarkable, I was a fool who was trying to convince himself of a lie." Lyra looked up at him, her expression unguarded in the firelight. "You were looking for a shield, Julian. I knew that when I accepted. I didn't expect you to see me. But I do see you," he whispered, stepping into the small space that remained between them. "That is the problem. I find I can no longer avoid the sound of your step or the way you look at a page. I find I am looking for you in every room I enter." He reached out, his fingers grazing the edge of her sleeve, then retreating as if burned. The safe arrangement he had constructed was falling apart, piece by piece. He wasn't afraid of the duty or the name or the social fallout. He was afraid of the fact that she was becoming real to him, not a duchess, not a Fairhaven, but a woman whose absence would feel like a hollow ache. Lyra did not look away. She stood slowly, her presence filling the quiet space with a gravity he could no longer deny. "Being real is a dangerous thing, Julian. It means you might have to feel something. I think," he said, his gaze fixed on her with a desperate kind of intensity, that it is already too late to avoid that. The fire popped, a spark landing on the hearth and dying instantly. Julian turned away first, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to walk out of the room, not because he was bored or indifferent, but because for the first time in years, he was terrified of how much he wanted to stay. The frost had begun to pattern the windows of the Fairhaven estate with intricate, jagged lace by the time the winter chill finally claimed Liora. It started as a subtle tremor in her hands while she worked at the ledgers and deepened into a flush that stained her cheekbones a violent, unnatural crimson. When she finally collapsed, it was not in a grand, dramatic heap, but a quiet folding of her body onto the library rug, her fingers still clutching a pen as if she were trying to balance one last account before the world went dark. Julian was the one who found her. The sight of her, small, fragile, and utterly still amidst the towering oak shelves, sent a jolt of raw, unadulterated terror through him that no battlefield or political scandal ever had. He carried her to her bedchamber himself, his strides long and frantic, ignoring the gasps of the servants who scurried out of his path. For 3 days, the Duke became a fixture in a room he had never intended to enter. He dismissed the nursemaids and the hovering Fairhaven relatives with a snarl of authority that brooked no argument. He traded his tailored coats for shirt sleeves and his pride for a basin of cool water. The man who had sought a safe marriage to avoid the messiness of emotion now found himself submerged in it. He sat by her bedside in the dim, amber glow of the hearth, watching the rhythmic, labored rise and fall of her chest. In the stillness of the sickroom, stripped of her modest gowns and the guarded expression she wore like armor, Liora's beauty was no longer a thing that could be overlooked. It was a quiet, devastating elegance that lived in the curve of her jaw and the way her dark lashes cast long, feathered shadows against her pale skin. He realized then that he had been a fool to call her unremarkable. Her beauty was not the loud, demanding sun of Arabella's golden features. It was the steady, silver light of the moon, something that didn't demand to be seen but became the only thing that mattered when the world went dark. "Stay," he whispered into the quiet, his voice cracking. He held her hand, her skin burning against his palm. "I only just learned how to look at you, Liora. You cannot leave before I have the chance to tell you what I see." He spent the hours reading to her, not because he thought she could hear, but because the sound of his own voice was the only thing keeping his panic at bay. He spoke of the estate, of the books they would read together, and of the silence he no longer wanted to share with anyone but her. He wiped her brow with a damp cloth, his movements reverent, as if he were handling the most precious of the Fairhaven heirlooms. On the third night, when the fever finally broke and the violent shivering subsided into a deep, natural sleep, Julian did not leave. He leaned his head against the edge of the mattress, his fingers still entwined with hers. He had entered this arrangement seeking a shield against heartbreak, but as he watched her breathe in the soft light of the dying fire, he realized the truth. The shield had become the heart. Liora was no longer an arrangement or a convenience. She was the clarity he had lacked his entire life. He had been so afraid of being hurt by love that he had almost missed the only person capable of healing him. The winter light filtered through the tall library windows in pale, dusty shafts, illuminating the space where Liora had first proven her worth over the estate ledgers. She was thinner now, her strength returning in slow, hesitant increments, but the air in the room felt different than it had before the fever. The silence was no longer heavy with things unsaid, it was vibrating with the weight of things that could no longer be ignored. Julian was standing by the hearth, his back to the door, watching the low flames consume a log. He had been there for hours, suspended in the quiet of a house that had nearly lost its heartbeat. When the soft scuff of Liora's slippers reached him, he didn't turn immediately. He seemed to be gathering himself, his shoulders tense beneath his dark coat. "You should be resting," he said, his voice low and roughened by the vigils he had kept. "I found the bedchamber too quiet," Liora replied, moving toward the desk. She felt a strange pull toward this room, the place where she had ceased to be a shadow. And there are still accounts from the northern harvest that require attention. Julian turned then, and the expression in his eyes made Liora stop. The cold, analytical Duke was gone, replaced by a man who looked as though he had been dismantled and poorly reassembled. He walked toward her, his movements lacking their usual arrogant precision. He stopped just before the desk, the mahogany surface a barrier he seemed suddenly desperate to cross. "I owe you an apology, Liora," he began, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "A debt I am not sure I can ever truly repay." Liora shook her head slightly. "You saved my life, Julian. You stayed when everyone else was sent away. There is no debt. There is the debt of the truth," he countered, stepping around the desk. He reached out, his hand hovering near her arm before he finally allowed his fingers to graze the wool of her sleeve. "I told you I married you for decency. I told my friend I married you because you were unremarkable and safe. But those were the lies of a coward." He took a jagged breath, his fingers tightening slightly. "I married you out of fear. I have spent my life watching men destroyed by the very passions they claimed made them whole. I thought if I chose someone who asked for nothing, I could avoid feeling everything. I thought I could keep my heart in a dark room and simply exist." Liora looked up at him, her eyes searching his. The vulnerability in his face was a devastating thing to behold. "But you were never nothing, Liora," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "And that was the greatest cruelty of all, that I tried to use your quiet strength as a shield against my own terror. I wanted a shadow, but I found a person whose brilliance was so steady it made the rest of the world seem like a flickering candle." He moved closer, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "You became my clarity. In the middle of the fever, when the world was narrowing down to your breath, I realized that I didn't want safety anymore. I didn't want a shield. I wanted you." Liora felt the sting of tears, not the bitter ones she had shed in the shadows of her sister's glow, but tears of a long-delayed relief. "I never wanted to be a duty," she whispered. "You never were," he said, his forehead resting against hers. "You were the only real thing in a life built on performances. I am no longer afraid of the dark, Liora, because you are in it with me." In the quiet of the library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, Julian Fairhaven finally stopped running from himself. He didn't kiss her then, he simply held her, wrapping his arms around her as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. For Liora, the sister who had been kept in the shadows, it was enough. She was no longer a shield or a convenience. She was seen, she was known, and she was finally, undeniably, home. The greenhouse was a cathedral of glass and steam, a transparent world where the rules of winter did not apply. Outside, the frost still gripped the Fairhaven estate in a silver vice, but within these walls, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, heavy perfume of blooming jasmine. It was here that Liora felt most like herself among things that grew quietly, indifferent to the demands of society or the cold judgment of the ton. She was kneeling by a bed of ferns, her sleeves pushed back to reveal wrists that were still a little too thin, when the heavy latch of the door clicked. She didn't need to turn to know it was Julian. His presence had become a permanent frequency in her mind, a low thrum of energy that she could feel long before he spoke. He walked toward her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path, until he stood just behind her shoulder. "The gardener mentioned I might find you here," Julian said. His voice was no longer the sharp, clipped instrument of a duke, it was softer, flavored with a hesitant warmth that Liora was still growing accustomed to. Liora stood slowly, brushing the soil from her palms. "I find the library too quiet today," she admitted, looking up at the condensation running down the glass panes. "Here, there is the sound of things growing. It feels less like a house holding its breath and more like a place finally allowed to exhale." Julian reached out, catching a stray lock of her hair that had escaped its pins. He tucked it behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her temple. The touch was no longer the clinical contact of a man checking a pulse, it was a lingering, searching gesture. "In the library, I told you that I was no longer afraid of the dark," he whispered. "But I realized I did not ask if you were still afraid of me." Liora met his gaze, her dark eyes reflecting the green of the foliage and the silver of the winter sky. She thought of the years she had spent shrinking herself to fit into the shadows, of the cold proposal in the drawing room, and of the man who had spent 3 nights holding her hand while the world faded. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear. "And I'm done being afraid of myself. For a long time, I thought that being chosen out of duty was the only way I could be chosen at all. I thought that being unremarkable was my only safety. But being safe is not the same as being alive." Julian's hand moved from her temple to her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a slow, deliberate reverence. "I chose you with my fear because I didn't think I was capable of choosing with anything else," he confessed, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "I looked for a shield, but I found a mirror. You showed me the man I was trying so hard to hide, and instead of turning away, you stayed." He stepped closer, the space between them evaporating until the only thing left was the heat of their shared breath. "I don't want a marriage of convenience, Liora. I don't want a partner who asks for nothing. I want to spend the rest of my life trying to give you everything I once told you I didn't have." Liora reached up, her fingers curling into the lapels of his dark coat. She felt the frantic, heavy beat of his heart through the fabric, a heart that was no longer in a dark room, but here, in the light, vulnerable and reaching. "Then choose me again," she whispered. "Not because I am safe. Not because I am a duty. Choose me because you want to." "I choose you," Julian replied, his voice a low, jagged vow. "Every day. Every breath." He leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was nothing like a contract and everything like a beginning. It wasn't the desperate act of 2 people drowning, but the quiet, profound realization of 2 people who had finally found the shore. It was a kiss born of true choice, a physical manifestation of the clarity they had found in the library and the strength they had forged in the sickroom. Liora melted into him, her hands moving to the nape of his neck, her spirit finally allowed to take up all the space it had been denied. In the humid warmth of the greenhouse, surrounded by the stubborn green of plants that refused to die in the winter, the Shadow Sister finally stepped into the sun. She was no longer a shield or an arrangement. She was a woman loved, and for the first time in her life, she realized that was more than enough. When spring finally broke across the valley, it didn't arrive with a roar, but with the same quiet persistence that defined Liora herself. The iron-grey slush of winter melted into the hungry earth, and the first pale primroses began to stipple the hedgerows like fallen stars. At the Fairhaven estate, the heavy velvet curtains that had shielded the rooms from the winter chill were pulled back, allowing the watery gold of the March sun to flood the library, the drawing room, and the long silent hallways. The change in the house was mirrored in the village below the gates. In the early days of the season, the arrival of the ducal carriage at the market square no longer brought the usual hush of intimidated silence. Instead, there was a new, curious warmth. The townspeople watched as Duke Julian stepped down, his movements still precise and powerful, but his face no longer a mask of cold granite. He did not wait for a footman to assist Liora, he reached for her himself, his hand lingering against hers with a tenderness that made the local gossips pause in their tracks. They walked through the stalls of the square not as a man and his shadow, but as a husband and wife in the midst of a shared conversation. The villagers noted the way the Duke leaned in to catch Liora's quietest words, the way his laughter, once a rare and sharp sound, now came easily and often. They saw Liora, dressed in a gown the color of new leaves, her head held high and her eyes bright with a confidence that had been forged in the crucible of a long winter. She was no longer the plain Fairhaven or the sister they kept tucked away like a shameful secret. She was the woman who had done what no army or politician could. She had softened the hard man's heart.